Oh, great. Dr. Chung, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. And thank you again for all your work. So I hate to ask this because we're still trying to get these disseminated, but what are your thoughts about the other forms of vasculitis? If we tackled, say, Behçet's or cryo or one of the others, how do you see that happening? And do you see a literature review that would be as large? I mean, would it be that huge a project?
I think uh, our literature review was so massive because we decided to tackle 7 different types of vasculitis at the same time. So we made our own lives more painful. I will fully admit that. I think and as you say, Joyce, we are still trying to finish up this effort. The Kawasaki guideline manuscript was recently accepted by the journals, and so we're working on getting that released in the near future. Once those efforts are done, I will confess there is an interest to produce guideline manuscripts for other types of vasculitis. But I think we have to recognize that in order to create useful, actionable recommendations, there has to be a sufficient body of evidence available to base recommendations on, or at least if we were to employ the GRADE methodology, this gold standard methodology, there has to be a sufficient body of evidence. If there isn't a sufficient body of evidence, it does then rely primarily on expert opinion. And if that is the case, there are other methods that are probably more appropriate in that situation. I think that's the first. I think also, so there is interest, but we don't have plans at this point to develop guidelines for other types of vasculitis. It's something that we would consider once we finish the current effort.
Right.
I'll also be transparent and say that, while the American College of Rheumatology, has, presented these vasculitis guidelines, they're not the only organization to do so. So, for example, the European League Against Rheumatism, EULAR, has also released guidelines for the management of other types of vasculitis. There are other more national organizations, such as the French Vasculitis Study Group or the Japanese Association of Rheumatologists, who have also released guidelines looking at treatment of various diseases, actually including Behçet's, as you mentioned. So while the guidelines released by other organizations reflect the treatment practices in those areas and also reflect the availability of medications in those areas, they can also be looked at to provide some guidance as to how, we should think about treatments for these other types of vasculitis.
I think that's a fascinating idea because the Canada just released some guidelines earlier this year too. And do you think there will be a debate on the international stage about how the guidelines vary from country to country? Or do you think, as you said, the medications that are available or the treatments that are available in other countries, that may be part of the guidelines?
There is already a debate going on internationally as to how, guidelines differ from country to country. And I think a lot of us recognize that there are differences in the guidelines in part because of differing expertise in different parts of the world. And I'll give you an example. So, for example, in giant cell arteritis in the guideline, we mentioned that we still support the use of temporal artery biopsy for a diagnosis. This is actually fairly different in Europe, where they recommend that the first step is to do imaging studies such as temporal artery ultrasound. The reason that we have not recommended that in our current guideline for giant cell arteritis is because we just don't have as much expertise with temporal artery ultrasound in this country than the European rheumatologists do. It's not because we necessarily think that this is a faulty technique, it's just we don't have the expertise in this country. And so when you see, the EULAR recommendations for giant cell arteritis and the ACR-VF recommendations for giant cell arteritis, you're going to see this difference. And it's because of a difference in just expertise.
Right.
Another area where there's differences is in the use of rituximab for GPA and NPA. And it's because, quite honestly, we have easier access to rituximab in this country than other countries do. I've had physicians, from Australia or even Canada come up to me and say, we just can't get rituximab as first-line therapy. And therefore, we can't really, use it as frequently as practitioners in the United States do. I think we're all reviewing the same literature. And so I think we all come to the same conclusions, but we may have, differences in how we implement those conclusions because of just differences in access and other factors.
Right, right. Yeah, I think it's fascinating because they're very similar in many ways.
Yeah. I think
So it wasn't
that's
like
reassuring.
Debate. Yes.
I think it's reassuring.
Absolutely, I agree. So do you think there'll be so many of our patients see other specialists, say nephrologists or pulmonologists or dermatologists. Do you see debate within their community? Are they discussing the guidelines?
Discussing the guidelines, I think there is, debate, some debate in the communities, and I don't think it's with the, overall broad picture message. I think it's with various nuances. So I can give an example. There is a treatment intervention called plasma exchange that is sometimes used for patients with GPA and NPA. And it's been the subject of a very large randomized trial that was published about almost 2 years ago at this point. And there are nuances to that trial where, that suggests that, plasma exchange should be used in certain situations and not used in certain situations. And the situations that where it could be considered would be patients who have significant kidney involvement or patients who are bleeding into their lungs. And so there's conversations within, lung doctors as to, how do the results of this trial affect our clinical practice? And a similar conversation is going on among nephrologists, where, what's the type of patient that may benefit most from this type of intervention, et cetera. So there are aspects of these recommendations that are being considered by other subspecialists.
Great. Well, so there are a couple questions in the chat window. So one person asked about the guidelines and if they're in print, if they're available in print form. And I wanted to let you know, they are in the resources section. There are three different documents. There are 2020 ACR. One is for the ANCA, one is for GCA and TALK, and one is for the PAN articles. And they're also available on the ACR website, and they're also available on the VF website. And I don't know, do you want to talk about your work on the pocket guideline, or is that still secret?
No, I think overall, so these publications and medical journals, sometimes you have to, subscribe to the journal to access them or pay a fee. That has all been taken care of with, by the American College of Rheumatology for these guidelines. So these guidelines should be freely available to you without any hassle, no matter what country you're in, no matter what part of the world you're in. You should be able to go online and download them and print them out. So you shouldn't have any barriers to seeing them. There are a number of different dissemination methods that are being considered, and that's the topic of Dr. Langford's talk, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about them, but we are developing other methods of dissemination, such as pocket cards.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is an all-out, this is such critical information, will help improve patients' lives with better treatment. And so let's see. We're not going to answer any questions about COVID right now because we're doing a special webinar on COVID. Ed Becker is planning that right now. So let's see, there is a question about any findings on the impact of patients using Actemra and anti-inflammatory natural remedies.
That was something that was not addressed in the guidelines, so I really can't say a whole lot about that. I think the use of natural remedies continues to be of interest to patients, so it may be a topic considered for the future.
Mhm. Let's see. There's one question. Are the new guidelines combining GCA and TOC to large vessel vasculitis? And they are together, but do you
So
want to?
so they are together, but they are handled separately. Just considering that there are different diseases, they affect primarily different populations, and there are some special treatment nuances for them. So they are handled separately. We haven't developed a guideline for large vessel vasculitis in general, as an overall topic, because it's a very it has a lot of different diseases in it. So I think it would be difficult to handle all of them all together in one topic.
Right. So I think we'll, what are your thoughts about the guidelines for pediatric care?
Yeah, so actually, when we first started this effort, and including pediatricians, in our voting panels and in our scoping panels and such, they were actually really quite surprised and eager to participate, since often these guidelines don't focus on pediatric patients. So as I said, the purpose of the guidelines was really to provide recommendations for pediatrics and adults. And if you read the text of the guideline in kind of the explanatory paragraphs, then there are certain situations where we make specific comments directed for pediatric patients. So the goal really is to have these guidelines apply to both pediatric patients and adult patients. But we do recognize that there are certain situations where other interventions or other strategies are needed for pediatric patients.
Right, exactly. Okay.
And
So,
the Kawasaki disease guideline is a pediatric focused disease.
Yes, we're very excited for that to be published. Very excited. So, okay, so this is a light question. One person asked about ANCA negative. Do the guidelines still apply, which you may be addressing in your GPA MPA? Do you want to take a stab at that one real quick?
I can discuss this further than GPA MPS session, but yes, the simple answer is yes, they still apply if you are ANCA negative.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and somebody asked about the credibility of the guidelines, and I feel like we have the ACR. We have. Do you want to speak to that? Answer that question.
I think the credibility of the guidelines relies on a number of different things. First, who is the group that's supporting the guidelines? And for us, that is the American College of Rheumatology, which is the premier, which is the primary rheumatology society in this country. We also have the Vasculitis Foundation supporting these guidelines, which is the premier patient support organization for patients with vasculitis in this country. The second is, who are the individuals participating in this effort? I don't think we got any pushback from the expertise that's represented by our core team, by the voting panels, by the expert panels, et cetera. So these are the most experienced vasculitis physicians in this country. One can also look at the credibility of the method that was used. So we're using the GRADE methodology, which is well recognized to be the gold standard method for developing treatment guidelines. And as I said, it's used by a whole host of other organizations, outside of rheumatology, et cetera, for a large number of diseases. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, these are peer-reviewed guidelines. So once we wrote these documents, they were reviewed by the ACR board, they were reviewed by journal reviewers. They've been looked at by a large number of people. And just to give you a sense, these guidelines were under review for almost 18 months before they were published. So they've been looked at by a large number of people. So, I think it's whenever you're looking at scientific information, it's always important to assess the credibility of the data that you're looking at. But we've had a large number of people participate in this effort, and we've used the best methods possible.
Right, I agree. And so my last question to you is, we sat on a steering committee meeting every Friday afternoon at 1 o'clock Central Time. And I mean, I sat on it for at least a year, and I know you all were meeting many years before that. So I hope you're doing something fun with your time.
I will say that it was a big relief to have the guidelines publicly released. As I said, many of us have been with this effort since 2016. The core team members, some of the members of the core team have been working on this since 2016. Members of the voting panel since 2018, 2019, that time frame. So it's been a long time in coming. It's good to see that they are finally out there.
Yes, very exciting. Well, thank you again. There is a question about disseminating out, and Dr. Langford, she is giving the second general talk after the breakout rooms, and she's going to be talking about the dissemination process. So I think at this point, I'm